Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Friday, March 14th, 2025. And on Fridays, we look into human behavior and justifications. And so today, I'm going to look into the rise of Nazi Germany. I remember in high school, I just started reading casually on my own about the Second World War. And I was trying to wrap my head around the notion of how Hitler could have risen to power, how Nazi Germany came into being. I wanted to understand their actions, and I wanted to understand why they ended up ultimately starting the deadliest war in human history. A war that was so deadly that it wiped out roughly an estimated 3% of the world's global population. To put it in perspective, you'd have to imagine a war today that resulted in the deaths of 240 million people of the 8 billion, actually slightly more than 8 billion currently on the planet. So I was especially perplexed in trying to understand the rise of Nazi Germany, the exemplar of 20th century geopolitical evil. What do I mean? Well, I'm referring especially to their attempt to perpetrate a massive genocide. Not only on Jews, although that was the primary focus, but they ended up targeting millions of other people as well. Through murder of hostages, reprisal raids, forced labor, euthanasia, starvation, exposure, medical experiments, and then, of course, ultimately the concentration and death camps. So the Nazis murdered anywhere from 15 to 32 million people. The more reliable estimates that I tend to agree with or tend to support place the number somewhere in the range of 20 to 21 million individuals. 20 to 21 million men, women, and in that number, more than 1 million children as well. And so the figures, of course, include the handicapped, the aged, the sick, prisoners of war, forced laborers, camp inmates, critics of the regime, homosexuals, and a whole range of ethno-racial groups, obviously Jews, but also in addition Slavs and Serbs, Germans themselves, Czechs, Italians and Poles, French, Ukrainians, and many more. And in addition, we're not even including the folks that died in the context of civilian deaths and military combat or war deaths. So I only had the broadest knowledge of what happened in World War II, or specifically in terms of the rise of Nazi Germany. I certainly learned about the Holocaust in school to a degree, definitely learned about Pearl Harbor, I learned about the Battle of Midway, the D-Day, the Normandy invasion. I learned a little bit about the principal combatants, the Allied powers, led predominantly by the US and the UK, and their former ally, the Soviet Union, and even China, who were fighting against the Axis powers, primarily Germany, Italy, and Japan. And I certainly learned a little bit about Hitler and the Third Reich. It's part of my sort of basic historical literacy. To be clear, if they mentioned Hitler at all, though, my teachers certainly condemned him as an evil geopolitical leader, one of the most evil, if not the most evil in history. But he was actually more like a kind of Voldemort figure in history class. In other words, he who must not be named. So we really didn't talk a lot about Hitler in the history classes that I was exposed to back in the day. So I never really learned then why precisely Germany took the pathway that they did into Nazism, or why the average German citizen, for that matter, might actually support the regime. I just figured, well, in the end, the good guys won, and, we learned to never let that happen again. In parallel, we were taught that many people, like my father, who fought in World War II, by the way, in the Navy as a blimp pilot, and he was, doing reconnaissance, trying to identify German submarines while he was patrolling the Atlantic Ocean, the east coast of the U.S. But I was taught that these folks, and like my father, ended up making the world safe for democracy and liberty, freedom. So, and that later meant, by the way, full-scale opposition to any and all forms of totalitarianism and authoritarianism in the 20th century, including opposition to our former ally, the Soviet Union, and hence the Cold War following the Second World War. And yet, at the conclusion of that Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it kind of seemed that, according to Francis Fukuyama, we were at the end of history, in a certain sense. And by that, Fukuyama meant that ever since the French Revolution, liberal democracies had proven to be the superior system, ethically, politically, and even economically, and would ultimately sort of be the final form of nations across the globe. Of course, many challenged that thesis, both at the time of its publication in the 90s and in the 3 decades since then. I've never really thought Fukuyama was really onto something particularly important because I've never seen the evidence that human beings would fundamentally and universally embrace liberal democracies the world over. And for that matter, I never gotten the sense that everybody was really tuned into this notion of liberal democratic thinking. Why not? Well, first and foremost, because we are still human animals. But as an extension of our human animalness, we're also incredibly tribal in nature and territorial in nature. And none of this necessarily bodes well for the notion of liberal democracies. But again, that's a broader philosophical discussion for another day. Instead, in today's lengthy vlog, I'm going to talk then about, or I want to return to this core question that's always perplexed me, and that, again, nobody in school ever really tried to answer. So why did the German people, and certainly not everyone, and not even the majority, depending on what aspects that you're talking about, why did they ultimately follow Hitler down such a disastrous pathway? World War II was a catastrophic event, not only for Germans and their own nation, but ultimately drew in much of humanity. And you could make the case we were precariously close to the collapse of human civilization. So what explains what happened in Germany? How could Hitler have ascended to such authoritarian rule? And how could so many people have supported a person that my teachers, again, routinely described as an absolute monster? Well, we'd need a whole course and series of books, perhaps, to answer these questions. So I'm going to do the best I can, but I'm going to do it in 2 vlogs. There's so much to say. I'm going to split this up into 2 vlogs. So part 1 this week. And we're going to look at the most important factors and the kind of preconditions or historical conditions that led not only to the rise of Nazi Germany, but the central question is, why did so many people end up supporting the regime? Okay? So again, part 1 this week, part 2 next week. So an interesting place to start, or to try to answer this question, would be with Adolf Eichmann. You may or may not recognize the name. Not quite the most famous, but quite a famous individual nonetheless. And certainly if you're older, if you're my generation, you almost certainly have heard of Eichmann. And in particular, I want to talk just briefly about Eichmann's prison diaries. He was such a key figure in helping to organize the Holocaust. He was the head of one of the major Gestapo divisions, Nazi Germany's secret service. And long after the war then, ultimately in 1961, Eichmann was convicted on 15 counts of crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes against the Jewish people, and membership in a criminal organization. He ultimately died on June 1st, 1962, and reportedly these were his final chilling words. Long live Germany. Long live Argentina. Long live Austria. These are the 3 countries with which I have been most connected and which I will not forget. I greet my wife, my family, and my friends. I am ready. We'll meet again soon, and as is the fate of all men, I die believing in God. Okay, so decades later, we have a transcription, the tape recordings made by Dutch collaborator Willem Sassen when Eichmann was hiding in Argentina after escaping from U.S. custody at the end of World War II. And there are the Eichmann tapes, My Role in the Final Solution, translated by Alexander Jacob and published by Blackhouse in 2015, an English translation, if you're interested. And in addition, we have False Gods, the Jerusalem memoirs that Eichmann wrote while he was in prison. And Eichmann, in his foreword, writes that he does not want or expect to receive any special treatment, and particularly for his role in the Final Solution. Well, why not? He writes, colleagues who have collected and expelled millions of ethnic Germans from Poland, Romania, and Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. Soviet-Russian colleagues who have led Soviet citizens by the millions into camps and deaths. Israeli colleagues, he says colleagues always in quotation marks, who have consigned entire Arab tribes settled for 14 years in Palestine to death and expulsion. Exactly, I collected and deported on orders and during the war over 1 million Jews. I do not want any pardon. I want justice, the same justice for all concerned, for whatever side they may have performed their service. So in other words, Eichmann, in his somewhat stilted language, or maybe it's with the translation, wants to convey to us that he's no monster, much like several of the other such tyrants who at different points in history and in different parts of the world have undertaken similar types of expulsions and mass deportations and detained people and exterminated peoples. And so Eichmann then is trying to erode, in some senses, the uniqueness of the Final Solution simply by saying, look at what our neighbors have done. They've committed similar kinds of excesses, or if you want to call them atrocities. And so this, in effect, represents his core justification. He was fully committed and never wavered from Nazism, the Third Reich, and the logic of the state oppression that he endorsed, just as much as the powerful figures that are much more well known, perhaps the Heinrich Himmlers, the SS leader, obviously the Führer himself, Adolf Hitler, and others. So in his writings then, and in the tape recordings, he does talk then about his how he enrolled in the Schützenstaffel, the German SS, and how that gave him a sense of belonging and identity and purpose. He writes about the, quote, historic struggle of the individual soldier, end quote, and arrives at a sort of unique understanding of the importance of the unity of the nation, as he talks about it for the first time. And Eichmann embraces the core ideology referenced at the Hitler Youth meetings and the campaigns that he inscribes he internalizes these key messages that are to support the future Nazi plans. The power of propaganda and the hate speech are quite evident, along with his sense in his writings and in his recordings of being wronged, his grievances. So he mentions, for example, the humiliation that the Germany and the German people experienced after the First World War, and as well as the consequences of the Versailles Treaty. He talks about the readiness to scapegoat whole races, communities, and the necessity of military resolutions to social problems. Eichmann goes on to claim, quote, I saw and see the necessity and indispensability of the battle, but only really in the political field, end quote. And he reveals that the demonization of a community, or the Jews in particular, could serve as a first step, since they were essentially viewed as guests who had, if you will, overstayed their welcome. And so instead, he felt that those identified then as guests increasingly were thought of as invaders and peoples who should be exiled or thrown out, and if all else fails, exterminated. So this rewriting of the narrative justifies turning these so-called guests who've lived together for perhaps centuries into categories of the other, of the unwanted, right? The us versus them, the insider versus outsider. And that in turn then justifies the full embrace of nationalism, and especially now under the banner of Nazis. And so Eichmann and his ilk could then start to imagine and develop plans for the treatment of their now explicitly identified enemies. So he teaches us, I should say, about the process of the internal alienation that the German people were experiencing. He talks about how to put into practice an immigration policy for Jews. He writes about how this one particular book inspired me to find a solution to the problem through which a homeland could be given to the Jews, and at the same time, the German notion could become free. The German nation could become free of Jews. So, for example, they might establish a Jewish state in Poland as a political solution. And so then Eichmann becomes increasingly strident in talking about the necessity to cleanse the homeland of specific communities, to exile them, to force them to demonstrate their citizenship otherwise. And there were real attempts involving the displacement of all kinds of different people. The rhetoric of purity, though deeply flawed, continued to emphasize the importance of protecting the German nation, the German peoples, the Aryan race, against contamination, against impurity. And all of this then aligns with the type of thinking and the type of ultimate final solution that Eichmann and others began to construct. He shifts part of the blame onto other nations as well. He writes, had other countries at that time been more willing to accept Jews, then hardly a single Jew would have still been left in a concentration camp, end quote. And so, in other words, within the Nazi state, derecognized citizens were to be exiled. And so the fault, he says, in some senses, was with other nations who didn't go along with their program, who didn't welcome in the Jews in sufficient numbers, or there weren't sufficient plans in place to make that happen. And so again, the onus was on other countries to accommodate Germany's sudden excommunication and alienation of peoples that no longer belonged in their view. And so the Nazi state was in the business then of purging its citizenry, okay? But they, at least people like Eichmann, felt that that was perfectly justified. After all, a nation must be pure. But the refusal of other nations to be more accommodating was what generated then, in their view, the ultimate necessity of the final solution. In that sense, then, states have a duty and an obligation to, look after their own citizenry, and usually, and in the case of people like Eichmann and the Nazis, they very narrowly defined their ethno-racial boundaries. And so again, they preferred instead to ship people out, to, if they were going to establish other places to be, other places to live, the displaced persons and the refugee camps and so forth should be, accommodated in other parts of the world. And so, in that sense, then, they decided to start creating their own camps. And when people couldn't be moved, in their view, they had no choice. I mean, at least initially, of course, they started with the idea of putting people into these labor camps, getting as much labor, getting as much work, and as much product out of them as they could. But they found that over time, this became increasingly difficult to do. There were huge internal costs associated with maintaining such a large population in these closed environments. And there were a number of other pressures at play, too, that ended up leading to the increased mass killings that picked up in the latter portions of the war. And so, but what's even more, I guess, fascinating from my standpoint is, what about the average German citizen? Okay, how did people make sense out of what was happening around them? Did they willy-nilly go along with what the Nazis were saying? Was it an overwhelming majority of the population? Was it a byproduct of the Nazi propaganda machine? What caused this shift in Germany? Not just the Eichmanns, right? And the German youth movement as such, but what happened amongst the average citizen in Germany? So this is the main question. I'll mention a few issues today, but I'm going to go into a deep dive next week as well into the range of what I think to be the most important factors or conditions that determined what happened. What I want to just say today is talk a little bit about the work of Peter Fritzsche, an historian of modern Germany, who has written several books based in part on the letters and the diaries of average Germans from before and then on through Nazi rule and the war itself. So what does the work reveal in terms of ordinary letters and diaries of family members? Well, I think probably the most important point to start with here is that, for one thing, we learned that many of the family members living in both Germany and Holland, right next door, were often deeply divided politically between, enthusiastic supporters of pro-Nazism and a highly skeptical anti-Nazism crowd. Okay? And their disagreements forced people then to have to try to explain themselves to each other in their various correspondence when they're writing letters back and forth, as well as, of course, over a telephone or in person when they were visiting. But they had to argue their points either in favor of or against and to justify their positions. But what we learned specifically or from the historical records are the evidence of these letters, the evidence from these diaries. And what the evidence revealed would be basically a qualified and not always easy, but an unmistakable desire to be part of the National Socialist movement, to be Nazis, in other words. Again, there were plenty of resistors, plenty of people who didn't, see the value or the light in doing that. But nonetheless, in the 1930s, people in Germany were deliberating about what they were seeing, communicating with their relatives, talking about what was happening, and started to rationalize on very sensible terms, in their views, why Nazism made some sense. They seemed to endorse many of the values that people held, and there seemed to be certain kinds of advantages that were being promulgated and discussed and popularized that had some compelling qualities. So in short, Germany was already deeply polarized and not simply brainwashed later by the Nazi propaganda machine. Though that certainly helped. It helped the cause tremendously down the road, and especially once Hitler firmly and finally came to power in 1933. Now, it's also important as a backdrop to understanding the rise of Nazi Germany, what was happening then in the early 1930s, and why there were federal elections in March, or on March 5th of 1933. Why then? What happened? Well, again, nobody really explained this to me when I was growing up, and so I didn't fully understand. I just knew that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. We were reluctant to get involved in the Second World War for a variety of reasons, and that was sort of the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Next thing you know, we're fighting in the Pacific. We're joining our allies in the European theater, et cetera, et cetera. You know how the story basically unfolds from there. But what was happening in Germany? What led up to this stuff? So we have to back up slightly. So Germany had held federal elections the previous year in 1932, and the Nazi Party at that time won just a little over 37% of the popular vote, and thus they became the largest party in the Reichstag. They had 230 of the 608 seats, and as such, they were entitled to select the president of the Reichstag, and they were able to they ended up electing Hermann Göring. Hitler asked to be made chancellor, but was instead offered the position of vice chancellor, which he refused. So, in his position, I'd say, as a Reichstag president, Göring asked that decisive measures should be taken by the government over the spate of murders of Nazi party members. So there was already some extremism and backlash to the Nazis themselves. And on August 9th of 1932, amendments were made to their main statute on the acts of political violence, increasing the penalty for those convicted thereof to lifetime imprisonment, 20 years of hard labor, or death. Special courts were then announced to try these particular offenses. And then when in power, less than a year and a half later, Hitler would use the legislation against the opponents and with devastating effects. So now, due to various aspects of political and economic instability, along with serious voter dissatisfaction with the status quo, remember this is the early 1930s, the Great Depression, it's tough on everybody. But the German president, Paul von Hindenburg, appointed Hitler as chancellor on January 30th of 1933. And the new cabinet was then sworn in during a brief ceremony. And most important, Hitler was, as I say, was named the chancellor. Wilhelm Frick as the minister of the interior, and Hermann Göring as the minister without portfolio. In other words, he's appointed as a minister without any specific responsibilities or head of a government department. And so in the months preceding the March 1933 election, the SA, which Hitler used to head up, and the SS displayed, quote, terror, repression, and propaganda across the land. In other words, Nazi stormtroopers unleashed a widespread campaign of violence against the Communist Party, the KPD, left-wingers in general, trade unionists, the Social Democratic Party, and the Center Party. At the same time, the Nazi organizations monitored the voting process. So, for example, in Prussia, some 50,000 members of the SS and SA and Der Stahlhelm were ordered to monitor the votes by the acting interior minister, Göring. And so the Germans, they went to the polls, they cast their votes, and the Nazi Party did still end up receiving about 44% of the vote, a clear plurality, not a majority, but they had the most votes of any party still. And so, because they weren't a majority, they were forced to maintain, at least temporarily, a coalition until, again, Hitler and his party could actually ultimately threaten, coerce, and obstruct members from other parties so that they couldn't take their seats in the chamber. And he was able to do this and thereby muster a 2/3 majority to be able to pass, and this is absolutely crucial, the Enabling Act. Why nobody ever told me about this in history class, I'll never know. But it was the Enabling Act that allowed the cabinet and effectively the chancellor, now Hitler, to enact laws essentially by what we would call executive order, and without the approval of the Reichstag for 4 years. So, with certain exceptions, such laws could then deviate, and quite significantly, from the Weimar Constitution. So who needs a constitution when you can order what needs to be done in your vision by decree through the Enabling Act, or again, what we would call something like by executive order. So in that sense then, or what happened was that Hitler successfully obtained a supermajority by persuading the Center Party especially to vote with him and in support then ultimately of the Enabling Act. That bill ended up being passed on March 23rd, 1934, with 444 votes and 94 against. And only the Social Democrats, led by Otto Weiss, opposed the measure, which then came into effect. And the bill's provisions basically turned the government into a de facto dictatorship. Okay? So, again, from my perspective, these are the sort of the preconditions that led to or helped fuel or fan the flames for the fuel to the rise of Nazism within Germany. And then there are a variety of remarkable developments and conditions that that set the historical precedents that might serve as signposts or markers that one could look for that preceded the rise of Nazi authoritarianism. And I think you'll find that the range of different reasons and different conditions are remarkably familiar and chilling, perhaps chillingly familiar. So in next week's vlog, I'm going to outline what several of these conditions are based on the best historical and sociological research that we have available on these subjects. For now, though, I've just tried to set the stage. And next week, in part 2 of this vlog, we're going to look at the several reasons and main reasons and conditions that led to such large swaths of the German population ultimately siding with, supporting Hitler, and willing to live and die with the tragic consequences of the rise and fall of Nazi Germany. All right. Thank you for listening today. As ever, I wish the best for you and yours. May you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts. And have a great weekend, but perhaps I'll see you tomorrow.